Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Army of the Dead. Real quick before I start, I want to mention that there's going to be a part later on in this review where I'm going to be neck deep in spoiler territory and talking about certain things that happen in the story in depth. So if you want to avoid spoilers in this video, don't worry, I'm going to let you know in advance when I start talking about those things, and I'll have a time code at the bottom of the video that'll let you know where to skip ahead so that you can continue on with the rest of the video. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump into the rest of the review. Army of the Dead is the latest movie in Zack Snyder's catalog and the first zombie movie that he's made since the very first movie that he's ever directed, which was 2004's Dawn of the Dead remake, a movie that I personally really enjoyed. It's probably my favorite movie in his entire filmography, and for that reason alone, I could not wait to see this movie. In terms of story, there's not really much to say as far as the premise is concerned. It's about a group of mercenaries that are hired by a billionaire to go enter a zombie-infested Las Vegas, go into one of the buildings that he owns and retrieve $50 million in cash, and then leave before the whole city is detonated overnight by a nuclear bomb. And honestly, that's all I can really think about to say in terms of the plot. There's a lot of other subplots that happen in the background between the many characters that are featured in this movie, but honestly, they're not really all that interesting. If anything, they kind of hold down the movie a little bit, but I'm going to talk about that later on in the review as I go along. Dave Bautista plays the lead role of Scott Ward in this movie, who's basically the leader of the mercenaries who all go into Las Vegas together. And out of all of the mercenaries, he definitely has the most depth and backstory out of all of them. He has a daughter named Kate, who he has a really strained relationship with for reasons that become clear early on in the movie. And on one hand, I did think it was interesting to see how the relationship between the two changed over the course of the story, but on the other hand, it didn't really change all that much. And honestly, the father-daughter relationship isn't what you're here to see to begin with. There's a lot of other characters featured alongside Scott and Kate as well, too many to get in detail with in this review, but a couple of my favorites were Dieter the safecracker. He was amazing from beginning to end. You can just tell that he's not used to being around conflict at all. He's always screaming his face off whenever a zombie comes near him. He just is awesome. I love him. There's also Lily, the French assassin, who goes by the name Coyote. I don't remember the whole reasoning why that was. I think because she's supposed to be an expert assassin of some kind, but I just thought her actress played the role of a quiet badass really well in this movie. Scott also has something of a veteran team that accompanies him in his mission in Las Vegas that he's been associated with in the past, and this comes in the form of his teammates Maria and Vanderohe. I mostly like them just because of the funny lines that they share with Scott in this movie. You can tell that they all have a long history together, and I personally feel that it just really comes off well in the dialogue. I'll be honest though, story isn't really the main reason why anyone goes to see this kind of movie. The main reason why people want to see a movie like Army of the Dead is because they want to see an army of the dead and people shooting those zombies to smithereens. And this movie does have that in spades, but in the end, I actually thought that it was pretty par for the course. The zombies are a little bit different from what you might be used to seeing. They're more interested in turning the living into undead and adding more to their ranks as opposed to eating every living thing that comes their way. There's also a hierarchical structure of sorts in the sense that there's an alpha male who's the leader of all the zombies, and every time he bites a new human being, that person ends up becoming a new alpha. I don't really understand how that works, but basically there's a few things thrown in this movie that make the zombies in this particular story a bit different from all the others you may have seen in the past. But even with all of those things in place, at the end of the day, they're still just zombies. You still kill them by shooting them in the head, and they're still as dumb as a box of rocks. This leads into the action scenes that are featured in this movie, which, as I said earlier, are pretty par for the course. Whenever there is action that's happening on screen, there's not much in the way of variety. It mostly comes in the form of the mercs standing in a big open room or in the middle of a hallway, dropping every zombie that they see by shooting them in the head, and that's pretty much it. There were a few moments where characters used knives instead of guns, and there was one instance where I can recall a character using fiber wire to cut off a zombie's head, but other than that, that's it. There wasn't really anything exciting to look forward to, which was a bit of a shame because they were teasing a big cement saw to be used for pretty much the whole movie. I just kept waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to use this weapon, and by the time someone did get around to using it, it was for a completely different reason than for anything involving violence, and that really ticked me off. It's not not that the action scenes are bad per se, they're all competently well filmed and they're all good brainless fun, if you'll pardon the pun. I just think that they could have been a lot better than what we got in this movie. I will say, however, that there are two action scenes in this movie that I absolutely adore, the first of which features the zombie tiger, which you may or may not have seen in the trailer for this movie. That tiger was amazing. I loved everything about that tiger, from the way it roared to the backstory behind it, and as morbid as it sounds, when it does inevitably end up mauling one of the mercenaries to death. I'm not going to spoil who it was, but that scene was by far the most intense the movie had to offer. There's also a great suspenseful scene in this movie that I love, whenever the mercenaries are trying to navigate around a group of sleeping zombies, and the entire time the tension is just building, building, building. It is almost palpable how suspenseful the whole setup is. As decent and even great as some of these action scenes are, however, I feel that some of the more technical aspects of this movie tend to get in the way of the action when it does happen on screen. I don't know what it is about what Zack Snyder sees in his movies, or rather what he wants his audience to see in his movies, but half the time when there's action happening on screen, I have a hard time seeing anything to begin with. There's a lot of moments in this movie's story that feature extreme close-ups in people's faces when it's not needed at all, and it just gets in the way of whatever we're supposed to be focusing on screen. And then at other times, whenever you're trying to focus on something, the image ends up getting totally blurred out and you have no idea what's going on. I don't know, maybe Snyder's trying to accentuate an emotion that we're supposed to be honing in on a particular moment, but I just felt more annoyed than anything else when those moments did happen. There are also some really terrible excuses for emotional moments that this movie tries to cram in for the sake of trying to add depth that, again, this movie just plain and simply does not need. And I'm not going to be able to talk about these moments any further without getting into spoiler territory, so consider this your one and only warning. If you do not want to be spoiled about anything that happens in this movie, follow the time code that I feature in this video and skip ahead to my ultimate verdict. First of all, there's an unnecessary love story that's featured between Scott and one of his fellow mercenaries, Maria, who's one of the veteran team members that I mentioned earlier in this review. There's a moment in the story where everything comes to a head and all the zombies are getting ready to invade the building where everyone's getting cash from, and literally out of nowhere, Maria goes up to Scott to talk about some weird random romance moment that never had any setup to it at all throughout the entire movie until that particular moment. They spend like 2 or 3 minutes talking about what could have been, and if they ever make it to the other side, are they going to go on a date or something like that. I just did not care at all about what was going on between those two. I was like, guys, you have more important things to be worrying about than some weird ass love story that had zero setup to it whatsoever. And then there's Scott's daughter, Kate. Oh my god, she made so many boneheaded decisions in this movie. I was ready to tear every hair off my skull by the time the movie finished. The only reason that she's with Scott and his band of mercenaries in Las Vegas to begin with is because she wants to look for one of her friends, a mother from the refugee camp that she was volunteering in, the refugees from Las Vegas specifically, and while that makes sense in theory, she has no business being involved with the mercenaries and surrounding herself with unnecessary danger like that. Everyone is adamant that Kate should not go in with them, but she doesn't take no for an answer, to which everyone just responds, oh, okay, well, then just don't stray away from us. Well, what do you think ends up happening later on in the movie? Well, she does what any terribly written character would do in her position, decides to take matters in her own hands and go in the middle of a barren zombie wasteland so that she can go find the woman that she's trying to look for. I hated Kate in this movie. It's because of her recklessness and poor decision making that she ends up getting every mercenary, including her father Scott, killed in one way, shape, or form. And by the time the movie is nearing completion, she totally forgets about the woman that she ended up rescuing. So in the end, her character had no point whatsoever other than just to manufacture her conflict. Terrible character. And it's not just the emotional moments in this movie that annoyed me either. There are some really huge gaping plot holes in this movie that are extremely hard to ignore even by Zack Snyder standards. There's this guy Martin who's one of the billionaire's elite bodyguards who goes into Las Vegas with the mercenaries to get the cash, and he ends up cutting off a zombie's head, which I mentioned earlier in this review, and apparently that zombie head is worth 10 times more than the money they're trying to get at the building, to which I responded, What was the point of it all? Seriously, even if it had to be a specific zombie head that you had to fetch, which sounds weird in and of itself, don't you think it'd be easier to get that head rather than have to lug up $50 million in cash and cram it all into this helicopter, which is the tiniest escape helicopter you could ever use, by the way. It was just pathetic what they had to work with. Finally, there's Van escaping the nuked remains of Las Vegas with all the cash he had in the vault that he was stuck with as he ends up making his way to the airport to try and live a new life with his newfound money. And there were so many variables that made no sense at that part. One, how is he able to survive the explosion itself? Two, how is he able to survive the nuclear radiation that the city is going through at the time? And three, how is he able to avoid being infected until the very moment that he ends up getting on the plane to live his new life? There are so many variables in this movie's story that make zero sense whatsoever. Obviously, it's not meant to be that kind of movie to begin with. It's meant to be a movie where you just turn off your brain and have a good time. But when you have this many problems in your movie, it makes you wonder what was going on in Zack Snyder's head when he was writing the script for it. There are a few other little things that bothered me in this movie, like the whole robot zombie thing that was going on in the background, but I'm going to reserve judgment on those things until later in the future when Army of Thieves, the prequel movie, comes out, as well as the Las Vegas anime series. I'm hoping by then we'll have some extra information to go with that adds some details to this movie's world. Overall, Army of the Dead is a total mess, but it's an entertaining mess. It's an average but fun zombie heist movie with a stupid story that tags along with it. If you're starved for action movies lately and you don't mind putting up with long random bouts of filler, then I think you'd be able to find something to enjoy in this movie. I think Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead is far superior to this movie in every way. I did enjoy Army of the Dead for what it was, but in the end I can't help but feel disappointed by it. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Army of the Dead. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Thai horror thriller Ghost Lab. Bye bye!